everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Tani Para. I'm the Client Services Project Manager here at Earthbound Media Group, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Persona-Driven Marketing, Integrating Community Outreach, Student Recruitment, and Advancement. So before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce you to who we are and what we do. Earthbound Media Group is an interactive marketing and communications agency that has over a decade of experience in the marketing of higher education, as well as healthcare, highly regulated, and entertainment industries. Our core services touch on all aspects of digital marketing, including branding, communication strategy and consultation, web, video, and interactive design and development, search engine optimization, mobile, display ads, and social media marketing. We want to remind everyone to please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing in the dialog box shown on your screen. We'll do our best to answer them as we go along, but we've also set aside some time at the end to get to a majority of those questions at the end of the presentation. And we'll also be recording the presentation and posting it to all of our social media channels, as well as at our EMG Knowledge Center, which you'll find on our website. And the slides will also be available to download via SlideShare, and we'll send a follow-up email with all of the links to all of these resources so you guys can access the presentation. Your presenter today is Damian Navarro, one of EMG's managing partners and the Chief Executive Officer here at EMG. Damian has more than a decade of strategic marketing, online advertising, enterprise technology, social media, and brand strategy experience, and he's worked with such clients as Scottrade and NBC Universal. His subject matter expertise is in such topics as technology innovations and marketing and behavioral marketing trends. And Damian's vision for the future of integrated marketing, advertising, and communications has made him a highly respected executive in our field. So without further delay, I'd like to pass it on to Damian to get things started.
Thank you, Tani. Let's go ahead and jump in, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I think this is a really exciting topic and would love to be able to really share a lot of the key findings that we've done, that we've come across when really discussing persona-driven marketing. So what we're going to do is going to really jump in a little bit more detail into defining what personas are and their advantages, understanding how brands are leading, brand leads to personas, so really just strong branding and identity really supports the development of those personas. Next step, we'll discuss really developing out brand and personas and the process associated with that. And then we'll talk about the persona-driven marketing for UCI's capital campaign that included aspects of both community engagement, student recruitment, and of course advancement. And then hopefully we have time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free as we're going through to be able to make those questions available. So let's really discuss the complexity of our audiences today. When we're looking at both offline and online, we are under a tremendous amount of stress to really appeal to a diversity of different types of not only demographics, but what we're going to really discuss is the psychographic profiles of our markets. When discussing things like education, recruitment, and student recruitment, and how those departments have worked separately from advancement and community relations and public relations in the past, we've seen very distinct approaches when it comes to the types of marketing and communications campaigns. And what that means is that there's been a silo effect. So in effect that the advancement and capital campaigns, of course, are primarily targeting both alumni and donors. But as we've begun to really find out, we've seen a range of different types of audiences start to engage with the institution in a multitude of different ways. So in this particular respect, what we're really talking about is everything from undergraduate and graduate students now really exploring other aspects of the university system, such as campaigns and PR pages and media pages, because of the way that search engines work. So if there's very popular videos that are being populated across YouTube in support of the capital campaign, the likelihood that an incoming student will see those videos when searching for your institution is pretty high. So it's really important to start to understand the ecosystem of communication as it relates to the face that your organization is putting out there. And as we do that, we really have to start to understand the true diversity of these audiences and how they are finding your particular message and your particular brand. So what we're going to do is begin to understand how do we start to group these individuals differently. The categorizations that you're seeing here are much more traditional in the way that most educational systems see their audiences, and that is purely based on the business need. So if we are looking at fundraising and advancement, we most likely have traditionally targeted the alumni donors. But because of social media and the way that it works is it's much more challenging and complex than that. And again, what we're really finding is that an individual that is connected via social media can really start to spread and propagate your brand messaging and call to actions. So in this particular case, we'll be discussing a capital campaign to a larger audience than you were formerly able to reach. So let's take a step back and talk about what persona definition is. Personas are essentially been used by a multitude of different industries for many years. One of the most popular was probably the real estate industry when these new developments would start. The use of personas was very popular because it would allow them to really explore the different types of individuals that a new community might be looking to attract. So that's probably where I first heard about personas somewhere around 10 years ago. Since then, they've been applied to two very distinct uses. One would be product and product development, which is probably even more historical than the marketing aspect. And then, of course, online marketing and user experience. So in this particular case, we're just going to make two assumptions that personas are fictional characters, and we'll show you how those work in a second, that are created to represent the different types of users or audiences within not only the targeted demographic, which is, again, what we've seen in the past, but really taking on a second layer of both attitude and online behaviors. The second one is very important. Personas are very useful in considering the goals, desires, and limitations of your audience and the web users in order to help guide decisions. So really where personas become really critical is in the development of web as well as print projects that are associated with any number of campaigns. And the most successful way that these are being used, of course, is when we kind of break through those silos and various departments and programs and institutions are coming together to understand their audience in its most complex form. So advantages to using these personas. Well, I like to jump to number 2, which is that they help prevent what's called self-referential design. When we make unconsciously project where we and you've seen this a lot, where we unconsciously are projecting our own ideas, our own experiences into the campaign or into the web experience that we're building. And that's very difficult because a lot of times we find politics are involved, we find budgets become very sensitive on who's paying for what. And what this allows us to do is to get away from that we're not necessarily being developing with ego in mind, but really allowing ourselves to totally and completely keep into consideration the market audience that we're trying to reach. So jumping down to number 4, adding on to that, it really provides that human face so that we can focus empathy on the persons that are actually represented by the demo and psychographic profiling. And we'll talk about what that profiling now entails and how we are adding layers onto what we normally would have done within the primary and secondary research strategies. The final one is data about the groups can now be put into a proper context and be understood and remembered in coherent stories. And that simply is responding to the fact that we can now apply a narrative to the development process that we weren't able to before. That a lot of times, just as much as siloed as your programs and departments can be, many times within the internal teams, the production teams that were building the type of campaigns and experiences were equally siloed. And so what this allows us to do and how we use it at EMG is that we're able to create a consistent narrative between the design and the creative departments, the content and user experience departments, the strategic and business unit departments, so that they are all completely aligned and speaking from the same narrative. So traditional demographic profiling, and I'm sure everybody's really familiar with this, especially if you're on this call, of course, included things like gender, income, education, or location or relationship status. And up until probably about 10 or 15 years ago, this was really the only way that we were able to develop campaigns from. And there, of course, are some major companies that have made millions of dollars in providing that type of data to us. It can be purchased, it can be learned, it can be observed, but it is relatively complex because of the amount of data. But what it really didn't allow us to test was real life, and that is experiences, life experiences. And I like to refer to it as the colors and the motion and the energy that really is in these individuals' lives. And because of extensive advances now in analytics and online behavior tracking, and of course in the way that we can observe individuals in the real life, we are able to paint a much more vibrant picture of who we're trying to reach. And so in this particular case, we've added on a second layer, which is the psychographic and ethnographic research and profiling aspect. And what this really allows us to do is just that, paint a much more cultural layer and understanding on top of our traditional demographic research. And and many times this tends to completely align with what we saw on the demographic side. But more often than not, in the case of UCI and many other of our clients, it actually paints a very different picture. Because as we know today, the access to information is incredible. And individuals are starting to understand and find others that aren't necessarily in line with what we traditionally would have said was their demographic profile. Those individuals that are cross classes, that are cross interests, that are cross experiences are growing rapidly as people find others that are interested in much broader themes than simply what's going on in their day-to-day life. The idea of impact becomes very, very important in these individuals' lives, and how we tie in and tap into what really makes them get up in the morning, and where will they be going, and where will they be spending money, and where will they be applying, and where will they be reading the news, becomes much more important because those are the access points. So some of the layers that we literally look at are obviously live user data and analytics, as I touched on earlier. Determine likes, neutral, and dislikes within their life, and that can cross over from brands, the media that they consume, the areas that they explore, the places that they eat. So we're really looking at real-world influencers and the responses that they have to those influencers. And again, those can be across a multitude of different environments and areas. So let's take it a step further. We really have to look at, before we understand where pathways cross, and when I touch on that, really where I'm speaking from is getting away from the siloed effect and understanding that yes, you will have target audiences, but how those audiences find you, who they're influenced by, and how do you reach them at critical areas in the life cycle of wooing them, we'll say, become very interesting when you really start to understand the life cycle of, we'll call it, a lead. So in this particular case, what really is, and I can spend a significant amount of time to explain this framework, but really what I want you to take away is understanding that an initiator or follower begins at the phase one. And what we're already doing is we're starting to classify based on a persona interest. There are two very different types of individuals, those that will initiate thought and those that will read thought. And individuals play these two roles throughout their lives in different ways. Not everybody is always an initiator, and not everyone is always a follower. But what we do classify within that phase is that is really the most opportunistic phase. It's also the most difficult to reach, because in this particular case, these are individuals that don't even know they need you, and you don't necessarily know that you need them. So really what we're doing within marketing is trying to reach either those first set of phases or the second set of phases. And what you'll quickly see down at the bottom is that we've identified two very different themes within trying to reach the phase 1 through 4 and the phase 5 through 8. And that is that within phase 1 or 4, this is where individuals tend to be very vulnerable and emotional in the way that they make their decisions and the way that they find you and the way they respond to the brand. Once they get farther along into, in this particular case, if we're talking about an advancement or capital campaign, giving you their money, or if we're talking about student recruitment, applying to the institution or organization, they begin to lose that layer of vulnerability and emotional aspect, and what we begin to classify become much more educated and now influenced by content. And so when we're diagnosing with a client of where they're really having challenges, this becomes a very important aspect before we even begin a layer of brand strategy or persona development. This becomes very critical that we specifically diagnose the phases where we are having challenges. And what I've seen in the past is it becomes kind of hard because many times individuals are attempting to do this really flashy, emotionally driven campaign with incredible video, and then they quickly find that it's not working. And why isn't it working is because they were really having challenges in phase 6. If they really went back and understood their audiences, they actually did an incredible job of getting them into the funnel. But once they were in, they didn't use their resources appropriately to just simply answer some basic questions that ultimately affect final adoption or yield. Now, the final thing to take away is what relates directly to social media, and that is the fact that there are so many layers of influencers now in the phase 8 is what we're really discussing, that back channel influence all of the other users and audiences that are coming up the funnel. And what that means is that the access to their information, and that is whether they are a fan or whether they're putting out negative information and have in fact become disengaged, can positively or negatively influence your entire life cycle. So it hasn't made things easier for us, but the way that we really start to understand it is that if we create personas around the specific campaigns that can self-identify other individuals that they can respond to or that they can trust, we can better manage the flow of that communication and influence downstream. So let's take an example, and I'm going to use it outside of education. I'm actually selecting another nonprofit partner that we had worked with, just so you can get a really good understanding of what a deliverable might look like for an individual persona. And in this particular case, I've selected 3 for a nonprofit. The 3 that we categorized are named, and we actually go further typically and give it a physical name, like Sally or John or Jamie. But we have here is the advocate, the learner, and the awakener. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a narrative story of what you might expect once you've gone through a process of persona development within your own institution, of the expectations that you can paint for your leadership, your communications individuals, advancement professionals, of where and how you might change the narrative of the campaign to include persona development within the development process. So in this particular case, we just create a stronger profile around the advocate. And what we had done with this particular client is we really had to understand, and I should give you a little bit of background, this is one of the largest animal society and animal rights organizations in the country with a no-kill policy. So it's very important for us to really create that layered approach to the different types of audiences that would be reaching their audience, reaching their website, and engaging with the content on their website. And how did we influence them? What were we going to provide them? What type of resources were we going to provide them? Became very important because navigation itself became, kind of comes from a traditional, almost brochure-like where navigation in the past was typically all about providing information. It wasn't necessarily about marketing. And so what we found is that without having personas in the mix of developing these types of experiences online, it is very difficult to stay away from the brochure-type strategy that we've used in the past, which is just very much show and tell of your information. So getting back to this is just one example of the first persona, which would be the advocate. And it really just, I'm not going to go through and read all of these, but as you can really understand, we really get detailed about the type of life that this individual might lead. And you may ask yourself, well, how effective is it really if you get that detailed and really understanding the type of content that you might provide them? And this is essentially just a benchmark. This individual, once named, starts to come up in almost every meeting that we have, whether it's internally or with clients, when we start to understand, would the advocate really respond to this? because again, instead of individuals playing devil's advocate, we have an individual that is not sitting in the room that we can talk about. And good or bad, they are the ones that slowly and efficiently begin to mold our ideas. They are the benchmark, and it really becomes a part of everyday life. And if we script down to the end, you can see that whatever the trigger, she's a member, a fan, and ready to be an advocate for free. That is the major takeaway of this particular categorization. So it really doesn't matter where she is from, how much money she makes, whether or not she received an Ivy League education, or whether or not she went to a community college. So it's just an example of how we're moving beyond the demographic and really starting to understand what actually drives this human's instinct and what drives their interests. Because ultimately, people are going to move up and down the socioeconomic classes throughout their lives. So to be able to kind of put that to the side and start to understand them at a different layer is going to make a stronger life cycle member, an advocate within your organization. The second would be the learner. And this is just a very different approach than the advocate would take of what their interests are and how you would appeal to them. In this particular case, we talk about an individual that is going to be conducting a significant amount of research. And so this is where we start to get into the layers of the experience and the layers of the site to start to appeal to an individual that is in fact not necessarily an advocate of a no-kill policy for animals, but is really more, is less connected to your brand and is really just wanting to use your brand as a specific knowledge center because they've heard great things. But the great opportunity here is that even though they may not necessarily be brand specific or glued to your brand from the onset, that we are hoping to get them to donate because they are looking to essentially make impact or a difference based upon the choices they've made by rescuing this dog. The second one is one that's kind of farther in. So if we reached farther past the learner, the first learner, number one, this is just one that has been a financial supporter of the organization for years. So there is a strong connectivity to the brand and is beginning to take potentially an even more direct approach to supporting the organization, such as potentially volunteering. So in this particular case, we're looking to move those that are in our funnel, that are in our database, that have been long-term candidates and proponents of the organization and getting more out of them. So it was very important that we segmented a persona off of that particular group to really understand the duality of the layers of the learner. And then finally, our final persona is the awakener, those that have the least amount of interest in the organization. And so in this particular case, if we think back to that life cycle, these are individuals really in that phase 2 and phase 3 that are still very much vulnerable and emotional. So in this particular case, they don't necessarily know about your organization. And when we talk about the UCI campaign, I really want you to take notice of the fact that they really tried to appeal to those that weren't necessarily even familiar with UCI and its work, potentially had found the information on the site and associated with the campaign in a very different way than you traditionally would in the materials that are in the communications plan that's typically put around a campaign. And the way they connect that is, again, through social media, social networks, and search engine optimization. The fact that they have popular keywords and terms around their site is very important when identifying individuals much earlier in that funnel that aren't necessarily looking to search for anything related to UCI. So this is a great example of how you can capture those early individuals in the life cycle and adopt them into your fold of the organization. So at the end, we really want to take away, when we were discussing the campaign strategy, that we knew this particular individual would be both curious and open, yet also cautious. So this is really how we take it a step further. And the fact that we now have identified these 3 personas, we have put pictures and images to those personas, and we begin to understand the 3 primary call to actions or performance indicators, as we like to call them, that will be on the site that allows each of them access points and control. And then what we're also demonstrating is that with those key areas of the site, many of them cross over. So if this particular case, if you were looking holistically at your site's, at your organization's website, and various experiences, microsites, content and social media channels, everybody in this world, if it's a public organization and it's not hidden behind some intranet, has access to that information and will find it. The way they're finding it is not necessarily just through the homepage. They're finding this through content that has been shared on their friends' walls. They're finding this from press releases that have picked it up and syndicated that content. They're finding this information in a number of ways. So if you start to think about the type of personas that might be created for you, you can take it much further than simply donors and alumni or students or community leaders. We can create a larger context around those individuals that really responds to their unique interest in the world and how and where they are looking to make impact. How and where are they sharing information online? Are they creating it or are they syndicating it for you? And that's the way we really begin to tap into the complexities of how a much stronger campaign will look. So let's take our next step, which is how do we approach brand and persona development? Well, there's a lot of things that we actually have to go to the basics on, and that's really about brand. And I'm sure many of you are sick about hearing the word brand, but it does become so important when deciding and determining the type of personas and the type of audiences that you ultimately are trying to impact, affect, and attract. So in this particular case, we begin with brand identity, and we ask questions like, what promises are your brand making? What are the core values that are actually backing that brand? How authentic is the brand? And of course, what stories are you sharing? The second would be insights, so layering that with actual quantitative data. How many mentions? What kind of conversations? What is the demographic profile of the brand that currently exists? So we actually treat you as an individual. And then finally, what channels are delivering that brand story? Is it online? Is it off? Is it something that you control? Is it another social channel or a fan site that somebody started? Is that negative? How are your brand values being conveyed both visually as well as contextually? And does user experience support that brand narrative? And that actually is one of the most troubling that we see many times, is really the fact that there are incredible aspects to your brand. You're absolutely delivering on that brand promise. But when it comes down to the user experience, you lose a lot of individuals. And the way that you look at that is we can tell with web analytics of where individuals are adopting and dropping off. We can tell how information is being shared. So does it all align? We say we are committed to sustainability, but do they actually perceive that you are committed to sustainability? So that's just simply saying, are there specific brand promises that you have that individuals are actually resonating with? So we looked at St. Cloud State University, a recent client of ours, when we were talking about the types of brands and narratives and stories, the type of brand message they have, and you look at competitors, and we start to understand the different types of ways that competitor markets might be proposing their brand narrative and their brand stories. And we look at personas within those markets because there is a lot of opportunity when you look at competitors sometimes to identify personas that they really are missing out on and not attracting. And then we compare those to our own. So in this particular case, we might also look at what type of content mentions is out there related to the brand. And as you can see, when looking at competitor markets, we want to really understand why there are mentions, why are people talking about the brand more. Is it simply technology? Is it access to information? Is it the amount of information? So before we even take a step further and really look at the campaigns or the website itself, we really need to create a benchmark of where we started. And in this particular case, we might look at simply 30 days, how much information and mentions around the brand is being created. And as we discuss personas, we really want to explore the individuals that are creating that type of information and content for you. Many of you guys have seen word clouds. As you see throughout the years, as we start to take snapshots from social networks or forums or just basic mainstream media related to your brand, we want to see critical themes that arise that really say a lot about the different types of audiences. But then we also start to see how things shift dramatically. And in this particular case, we looked at St. Cloud from 90 days and then 30 days to understand the shift in the type of content that was being created. And this becomes really important because, as we know, websites and campaigns can no longer be static. They have to constantly be adjusted as organic entities based upon the performance of them. And we'll show you some really good examples about how UCI has done just that. And then finally, does that user experience support the brand narrative? We look at every single aspect of every layer of both the web presence, the print materials, and obviously internally of how that is being governed and created to really begin to an understanding of how effective the user experience is in supporting the narrative. So what type of activities do we employ? Well, the good thing is most of these things can all be done right within your organization itself. You don't necessarily need an agency to come in and step all over toes to begin some of these activities. I think it's really important that you begin to think really clearly about what has been missing. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the activities that would be associated with traditional marketing or demographic research. I think we're all really familiar. One of the activities that I want to really explore is those that really help us to understand that extra persona level of psychographic and ethnographic information. So some of the activities that we employ are things like persona attribute discovery and card sorting exercises, where we really start to put down different interests and ideas around audiences associated with the organization. Where do they eat? What do they wear? What do they drive? Where do they live? What color is their home? Who do they talk to? Who's most active on their Facebook walls? Where do they stop to get a coffee in the morning? What organizations do they donate to? What organizations do they aspire to donate to? Have they ever volunteered? You start to get the idea, and then we begin to assemble those based upon potential personas until we can categorize those in new shapes and forms. The second was a brand and marketing strategy scoring matrix, where we basically score the organization and institution against other competitors to really understand various brand attributes and narratives and stories and content that is out there and how that ranks them against everyone else. And this becomes that important quantitative level that really gives us that extra layer of knowledge that we need to incorporate personas into a marketing-driven theme. Creation of themes and mood boards also become very important when understanding the colors, the richness, the textures of individuals in your organization. Many times we will meet with students, we'll meet with alumni, and we'll have them put these mood boards together, and we'll start to see some very distinct images kind of rise out of this that can be shared, that are shared images, imagery, or feelings across a diversity of audiences. And this is where there's some really interesting things that happen, because this is how the individual that is associated with the organization, not necessarily the decision makers, really see your brand, really see your image. And sometimes there is a distinct misalignment between the type of image and branding that we're putting out. Now, it's not to say that a brand can be aspirational in the type of image they'd like to portray. But if it is so far misaligned from the actuality of the organization, of how individuals actually see the organization, that we're really going to start to see a disconnect when the communications model is put in place. And so you can't tweak it with simply content at that point. There is a complete reworking. We talked a little bit about social listening as well as crowdsourcing, and we use that through paid crowdsourcing and social listening tools. But there is an entire level of analysis that comes on top of that when trying to determine the true sentiment of an organization. Second, there is a number of different types of strong visual documentation that we do when we try to understand the lifestyles of the target audience. And that includes handing out cameras to students, alumni, community organizers, really getting a grassroots feel from on the ground of how individuals are actually interacting. Do they match the research that we've cultivated? Does it match? Does it really retain that level of authenticity between what we thought and what we're now seeing? And then finally, when bringing individuals together, it's really important to use technology to get a much larger sampling of stakeholders and testing when it relates to the types of personas that we've developed and whether or not those are effective in developing and influencing the campaign itself. Finally, we look at a multi-tiered approach when approaching web user experience as a whole. We have that brand strategy that we began with. We include a digital strategy and media planning and content and assets that layers on top of that. And then finally, the persona segmentation, which is highly targeted communication based on interests and education throughout the decision journey, is our final layer. And then once we've gone through that, that's where it can really get fun. And things like website requirements, documentation, of course the marketing and communications plans, and you can see there that there is a level of life cycle already incorporated into that. And then of course the really fun stuff that it seems like we used to skip to right at the beginning, which is the creative and content. And so managing expectations within your internal team that this is going to be a slightly longer process than what's seen than potentially what they've seen in the past is very important for setting those expectations from the beginning. In this particular case, obviously at the very end, measurement and optimization becomes absolutely critical. As I said before, websites and campaigns are no longer these static brochureware entities. They must be very organic and they must continue to evolve. And that becomes really important because you have personas that you will be testing within the first year to 2 years to see if we really nailed it. And what we've seen in the past is sometimes a fourth persona might emerge. I don't know if I mentioned that in the beginning. We do try to keep them to approximately 3 to 4 because once you get outside of that area, it begins to become very complex. And you begin to kind of miss the point of what the personas were there in the beginning, which is to really isolate and synthesize our ideas, not necessarily make them tougher. So let's jump into UCI. I have to admit, this was not necessarily EMG doing all this work. UCI has evolved the site past what it even was when we touched it a couple years back. But for me, it's just such an exciting case study onto themselves of how a really diverse and vibrant team with some incredible ideas of how they can rethink approaching campaign strategy and including and incorporating a multitude of different business units that you typically don't see being included in advancement and capital campaigns, such as student recruitment, such as communications and PR, such as many of the professional schools, that all played a part because UCI really understood the community aspect of capital fundraising. They really understood that every individual, whether across every demographic, had a new layer of access to the type of content and to the type of impact that UCI was presenting. So in this particular case, I'm just going to bring up the web presence first, and you can see here, and I don't know if this looks very different than what you've seen in the past from other capital campaign sites, but the capital campaign had already been underway for a few years when UCI approached us to really reimagine the web presence for the site. And in this particular case there, we created a new strategy that included, of course, personas right into the mix. So let's dive in a little deeper and I'll show you what that meant. So we actually created 5 personas for UCI. So I already broke my rule, right? But the 5th persona really doesn't count because it's not a persona. In this particular case, we just wanted to make sure, and this comes back to not necessarily politics of the organization, but business practices, that the 5th persona essentially was those that wanted to kind of skip past identifying themselves as a persona and give directly to scholarships and fellowship. So we're really going to emphasize the first 3. And the reason why I'm also just not including the 4th is the fact that learning, of course, is directly associated with an institution of higher education. So that was a no-brainer. What I really want to spend just a little bit of time on is the first three, which is that UCI, instead of typically what we've seen with capital campaigns in the past, where people are supporting specific programs, specific schools, named schools, has been the approach that typically we take when trying to get individuals money, to make it simple. But in this particular case, we wanted to create let's go back to 3 personas around a new impact layer that UCI was demonstrating significantly within its brick and mortar. And that was health. Those individuals that are most interested in supporting the health of their community, the health of the world, and really looking to, with their money and their support, or in the case of student recruitment, because as we'll see, much of the content here is being syndicated across campus and is accessible by anybody interested in coming to UCI. And in fact, in search results is one of the more highly ranked organically than any of the other pages at UCI, simply because of the types of content that they're putting on the site. It's very critical to understand that individuals that are coming to UCI, this is something that they might be interested in impacting. The second was the new global community. And we'll talk about the idea of the Global Village Campus. And as you'll see, many of these directly align with the brand promises of UCI as a whole. And so it's really important that we connected those brand promises not only with factual, authentic content, but directly to personas. And so it was really important that when we created them, that there was a tremendous amount of content and energy and excitement at the organization, that when an individual that identifies themselves as a global citizen, or as a health innovator, or as somebody that is looking to impact the environment, that they immediately found information that was true about UCI, not necessarily aspirational. So let's dig in a little farther and let's click on health. So what you'll see is, as we know, individuals are at this particular point in their communication discovery, what I talked about earlier, are very vulnerable and emotional. So as you can see, we took UCI has taken a very theatrical approach to responding to those individuals' thoughts, ideas, etc. And then as we scroll down into the site, that's where we really get into the meat of the content. Obviously, every area, and you'll even see that within the URL at the top, is completely branded. So UCI Future Health. And we'll talk a lot about those vanity URLs that can be used on publications and materials to further segment this type of content away from the other content. Because once somebody has identified as those that they want to impact health and the future of health, we really don't want them to leave that environment, because they have now self-identified, this is in fact something that is very powerful for me, and we want to make sure that they stay within that small ecosystem of UCIFutureHealth.com. So all of the content that is being used in areas of the site that is relevant to all can be found here. But then we can also start to establish and segment and tag those information that are only relevant to the health individuals. So as you can see, as you explore in the media, getting connected, and about our campaign, you can constantly dig in deeper to the type of content around health. Now, let's go into our global community. So, very similar format. Obviously, we do understand that individuals will click around, that maybe they haven't identified themselves with a specific persona. So we also want to make sure that we maintain a level of consistency in the user experience, so that as they begin to navigate the site, there really is no fear of finding a corner that they can't find their way out of. So in this particular case, we wanted to make sure that there is that layer of familiarity that follows the individual throughout the site. So I hope you guys are really understanding how personas begin to work and how we can start to segment individuals, not from what we've seen in the past, which is by donorship, but to take a step back even further in the life cycle of that individual before they may necessarily be ready to give. Now, as you'll see throughout the site, there are plenty of areas for them to either get connected and to join the UCI community or to donate. So we always wanted to make sure that within one click that was there. So I'll let you guys explore if there's other areas of the site that you would like to do, but let's jump in a little further into best practices associated with persona-driven marketing and how you can optimize the content that is being created on the site. In this particular case, I want to dive a little deeper into how do we create and syndicated what we refer to as branded original content. There is this term that marketers now have to think like publishers, and that, of course, can be extremely taxing and difficult on an individual because for the first time, where marketers traditionally just had to build these web presences in this particular case that were really driving donors and have now had to create this kind of long tail communication drip campaign with these individuals, especially the fickle ones that may not necessarily be willing to give money, or in the case of potentially student recruitment, to request information, set up an appointment, or apply. So how do you do that? Well, individuals are consuming content at a mind-blowing level and speed. And so, of course, we have to appeal to that individuals now don't necessarily trust the information that you put on their page. They want to see stories. They want to hear from other individuals that look and sound like them. They want to explore other sites. And so how do you meet those requirements? Well, you create and begin to create your own branded content, your own news, really interesting news, not necessarily within your social channels, or in this particular case, what I'm showing is, we'll talk a little bit later about the actual widget, but news that is really engaging and interesting to a diversity of audiences. But what you will also see is that each of the news areas have been categorized by persona. They've taken it a step further. Now, these aren't necessarily the same personas that we see up here within the Global Village campus and learning healthcare in the environment. These are a little bit different because we also understand the duality of the user. We understand that necessarily users aren't just here to donate. They're here to find information. And so what we want to do is we also want to connect them, and this is through syndicated content, back into the university through a diversity of its channels. And how do we do that? Well, they've created this unique widget that allows people to search through categorized information around future trends, giving back, hot news around athletics, global leaders, and you can kind of go on. Your health, the future of medicine, Mind Frontiers, their members, Orange Coast Magazine. So this is really important, as you see, YouTube, Orange Coast Magazine. There are other technology providers, media channels, and partnerships that UCI has created to syndicate their content, whether it's original from another media publisher or whether it's original from UCI, directly into their communication funnel and their web experience. So the whole point of this is that you are now driving that casual observer to awaken to the greater need. Simply meaning you're attracting individuals that might have been on OC Magazine or might have been looking for information about athletics and subtly introducing them to a new proposition, which is, hey, you really love the baseball team, or hey, you really like that bike campaign that we did about biking across Orange County. And now we want to introduce you to how UCI is also impacting the world or the environment. they can take that information that people are looking for and direct them directly to more information. So how do we power up the community? What kind of calls to action, now that you kind of have those individuals involved, what's the next step? And in this particular case, we want to start to help individuals identify, and I'll show you this in a second, as either celebrities or ambassadors, and lead conversation, create information, assemble other like-minded in groups. But the fact is if we don't give them that opportunity, then it becomes very difficult for them to assemble. So there is, of course, a huge multidisciplinary opportunity across various business units within the organization to create these types of larger initiatives. And in this particular case, we're simply showing an example of one of them. So for California and the United States to succeed, we must prepare the next generation of leaders and innovators, pioneer new technology, and to understand and benefit from the global economy and culture. Find out how far 1 billion can go. You're invited to be part of the community effort that promises to have worldwide impact. So it shows there's a direct correlation between future innovation, a better world, and a larger community that they can be a part of. And then finally, we talk a lot about owning and branding the Knowledge Center. So taking it a step further, individuals are learning to consume that data. We already discussed that. So taking that a step further even more is how can you start to hold on to and create and manage that content that individuals are in fact looking for. And what we're seeing here is a snapshot of the media channel within the UCI Future campaign. And that is that there's tons of videos and content that some may be directly and some might also be indirectly related to any of the campaign ideas of impact. But we knew that we wanted to be our own publisher. We wanted to cover stories that we thought were interesting. And so UCI has done an incredible job of categorizing and syndicating those stories in a very user-friendly format. And then finally, apps. As you saw earlier, as it was loading, the news widget, the campaign widget that really covers interesting news that relates directly to the campaign is a downloadable app. So that type of accessibility and that type of reach becomes highly personal and informative, but also very powerful in the way that you are allowing individuals to access the information associated with their money being spent. And then the other cool thing is you see, again, never far away from a clip, there's a donate online now directly at the bottom of the app. So if there is individual calls to action, so when we talk about powering up the community, let's talk about group buying. Let's talk about potential relationships with Groupon in the future where, say, 100 people donate and you get X. The ability to tap the community through this type of direct wireless device applications is limitless. Unlimitless in the types of ways that you can use it. So as we begin to wrap it up, let's talk about the performance to date. UCI, and if you saw on their homepage, has actually not only achieved but now surpassed their $600 million milestone since launching the Shaping the Future campaign in July of 2005. So the $609 million, I just realized, has actually already been surpassed. And the campaign, more importantly, with the approach that UCI has taken to really understanding their personas beyond simply alumni and donors and really grasping the true entity of the community and all of its uniqueness has led to some really fascinating outcomes. One would be doubling UCI's endowed shares, establish and naming new schools, facilities, and programs, which of course is a little bit more typical. I think the ones that really stand out are setting historical annual fundraising records and significantly increasing the university's endowment, and then also enhancing alumni and student engagement and philanthropy with more than 128,000 gifts made to the university during the campaign. So they're way ahead of where they thought they would be, and I believe that is a direct correlation to the complexity that they approached solving their audience strategy. And that's it. So if you guys have any questions, I know we only have a few minutes here. Obviously, it's very difficult to answer individual questions that are related to your unique organization or program. So what I would suggest is getting in touch with either myself or using any of and I can just give out my email. It's dnavarro@visitemg.com. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have or potentially just point you to other information that is available out there. So let me just check if we have any distinct questions.
Hey, Damien.
Yeah.
We have, I think we've got time for a couple of them. We have a few, so if we don't get to your question, we can definitely address those with you via email. So the first question is, when you talk about benchmarking the number of mentions that you get, what is the universe of outlets that you are considering? Are they strictly media mentions or social media mentions? And are they all within the sphere of online marketing?
Well, when we talk about online universe, we have to be careful because, yes, I mean, we have to track data and tangible data, and we can't necessarily go out and survey the general public walking around. That's not in a very efficient way. So, yes, it is predominantly digital. And I don't know if we saw the slide. If you decide to go back a few in looking at the presentation, you'll see that we do use media mentions. We use social networks, and then we also just use traditional forums and discussion boards. So those are probably the three areas that we have the most clear understanding of data sets that we use for the social listening.
Okay, perfect. Time for one more. Someone asks if we use a system like Radian6 for social listening and brand sentiment measurements, or what tool do we use?
We have used Radian6 in the past, so that is probably a good middle tier that isn't necessarily enterprise, and would highly suggest potentially using that to get at least an initial data capture. The amount of information becomes a little convoluted in trying to understand the patterns that are arising, and especially when you start to understand the different types of sentiment and whether it truly is tracking it as positive, negative, or indifferent. But more importantly, Radian6 is absolutely a great way to get started.
Okay, perfect. That should wrap us up. Just a final reminder to everybody that we are going to be sending up follow-up emails. We'll address your questions if we didn't get to them, and we'll also give you information on where you can find this presentation. And also feel free to follow us on our social media channels. You can find us on Twitter at EMG the Agency, or you can find us on Facebook as well. So thank you everybody for joining us. Take care.